Everybody, is my mic on? Can you hear me? Super. So good morning and a warm welcome to the panel organized by Family Federation of Finland and MEDAM. My name is Krista Taubert and I work with the Finnish Broadcasting Company, and I'm happy to moderate this panel. The theme of this panel is extremely important and a timely one. The number of people fleeing war, persecution and conflict exceeded 70 million globally last year. And it's important to keep in mind that even if we concentrate today to Europe and Finland, most of the world's displaced people do not live in Europe. And we will use the term migration, and we will talk about asylum seekers, refugees, and work-based immigration as well. And that's the challenge of this panel, but also I guess it's a huge channel for the policymakers that there are different kind of reasons behind this phenomenon. But before we hear elaborated views about the European solutions to these policies, I will introduce our excellent panelist. Professor Matthias Lücke from the Kiel Institute of the World Economy, Germany. Your research and teaching focus on migration, development, international trade and European integration, but I understand that you have had an important work with the MEDAM Institute recently. Would you tell about what was the research about?
Well, this MEDAM project is about asylum and migration policies in Europe, and we are trying to find more effective and more humane solutions than what is going on right now. This is supported by a private foundation in Germany, which is where the M comes from, Mercator. And the point is to get into a conversation with policymakers, researchers from Kiel, from the European University Institute in Florence, including my colleague Anne-Marie, and from the Center for European Policy Studies in Brussels, doing academic research, but also focusing on this conversation to involve policymakers in searching for solutions together rather than us throwing a plan at them. And this is the project, and we are also looking not only at Brussels, but also at member states, and this is why we are very happy to be here.
Thank you. And then we have the postdoctoral research associate Anne-Marie Jeanette from the MEDAM project. What is your angle on the MEDAM project research?
Okay. My research focuses on the policy preferences of Europeans when it comes to policies regarding immigration and asylum seeking and refugee policy. And so we look at the types of things that Europeans prefer, differences across countries, and reasons why certain individuals formulate certain preferences.
Thank you. And we have visiting specialist Anna-Kaisa Hiltunen from Ministry for Foreign Affairs of Finland. And from you I will ask, as this is the European presidency going on now, that how big of a focus the migration policies will be during the European Union presidency for Finland.
Indeed, can you guys hear me? Yeah. Indeed, we've already seen some focus. As most of you remember, there was a meeting for the Ministers for Interior a couple of weeks back where they tried to look for solutions to the sort of pressing issues that we have on the Mediterranean, how to disembarkate people safely and how to relocate them from the first countries that they come to. However, this was not, they didn't find a solution, so the discussion is ongoing for now. And I understand that later in September there will be a follow-up meeting in Malta on how to go forward. So indeed, that is one focus that I think will be somewhat in the shadows. It won't probably be so much in the limelight. Mm-hmm. And then Finland has very clearly said that one of the focus that we do have in our foreign policy in this Council presidency is the relationship with African countries. So that would mean a relationship with countries that are transit countries and countries of origin for migrants. So that sort of external aspect of the migration policies will definitely be a focus.
And then we have Mauri Kotamäki, Chief Economist from the Finnish Chamber of Commerce. As you are an economist, is your focus a different one from the earlier ones that what we have heard here?
Yeah, thank you. Great to be here. Yes, it's a little bit different, I would say, because as an economist, I tend to look at things from the economic perspective, and therefore, kind of natural way to look at immigration in a broad sense is to look at the work-related, work-based immigration, which is slightly different context than purely humanitarian immigration, although they do have a lot of in common at the same time. So they are actually deeply linked into each other. And like as a side note, actually, I would also see it like this, that all immigration or migration is actually in the end work-based, at least if you're working age. So even if you come for humanitarian reasons, probably most societies want these people to work in the country where they come into for many reasons.
Thank you. I'm excited. I'm curious to hear more. What about you? Are you excited about the subject? And we also want you as an audience to weigh in later on the discussion. If you have questions, feel free to ask them, but towards the end of the panel then. And if someone is following us through Twitter, we also can take questions from Twitter. So Dia Sorsa will be following the Twitter feed. But now let's turn our side a little bit back and take a few steps back towards the year 2015. And we'll start with you, Anna-Kaisa. More than 1 million migrants and refugees crossed into Europe 2015, and this sparked crisis in the European Union countries who struggled to cope with that. What caused the crisis in 2015?
That is a very good question. Like you said, you mentioned the numbers, more than 1 million people. Now it's easy to think that that was the cause of the crisis, but what I think is that it wasn't that much about the numbers, but more about the point that we had rules and regulations that we were unable to put into practice. So basically what we had, and still have, is the Dublin regulation that basically states that it shall be the first country in the EU that the asylum seeker comes to that should be responsible for the reception and the procedures, so the taking care of the application. Now when more than 1 million people came in through Greece mainly, and Italy and other southern European countries, they were not able to stick to the rule. So people were able to move quite freely throughout the EU, so into other EU countries, which caused a feeling of loss of control. We're not in control of the situation, and sort of a bit of a panic in the capitals and in Brussels as well, which then led to border controls being put up in the Schengen area, so inside of it, which was not unheard of, but still quite unusual. So I would argue that this was the reason. We had rules that we couldn't, in that situation, implement correctly, and hence we sort of panicked and had a feeling of loss of control.
The rules as such weren't wrong, it was the implementation. Do I understand correctly?
Sorry, what's that?
The rules, the Dublin Treaty wasn't the problem, it was the implementation.
Exactly, we were not able to implement it in the EU or in the member states.
So how much did the worries and the panic vary in different capitals in European Union?
Well, obviously the southern countries that sort of were under this pressure were worried that they will be left alone once again, as have been their worry since the 90s, basically, when the Dublin rule was first drawn. So they did not want to be left alone. Hence, the people were also let to move on in Europe. A lot of other countries were then worried that, you know, everyone will come to Germany, or how come so many people are coming to Finland? So kind of this feeling of now we're going to have to be responsible. And countries in the eastern, sort of Middle Eastern Europe, such as Hungary, said, no, this is not okay for us, we're not going to take in people, we're going to build barriers on our borders, and this is just not okay, we don't want migrants. They were pretty clear about that. So there were these kind of cleavages, if you wish, in the EU.
That was 4 years ago, and what kind of policies do we have in place now?
That is also a very good question. I need to start my answer with saying that first of all, the numbers of people coming in have gone down to pre-crisis levels. So we have about half of the amount that we had in the crisis yearly now, or last year. So a bit more than 500,000 people. I think that one of the biggest reasons that the numbers have gone down so much is that we've basically done a lot of collaboration with countries outside the EU. So we collaborate with Turkey. Turkey is hosting more than 3 million asylum seekers and refugees. So they're basically taking care of some of the jobs that we, in my mind, should do. The same with Libya, I would argue. There's a lot of collaboration going on there. So the Libyan border guards are sort of bordering or policing the southern border of the EU at the moment. So this is one thing. We have a lot of external policies. Internally, we still have the same Dublin rule in place, but we also have a bunch of proposals from the Commission on how to renew the whole asylum system, the common European asylum system. And one of the proposals is to renew the Dublin system. So basically the question is how to relocate people, if at all, from the first country so that we would not end up in a similar situation like we did in 2015 and 16. And this proposal has now caused basically a deadlock in the EU. So we have a lot of discussions been going on for, since 2016, but nothing concrete yet. So for now, what we've seen this summer is sort of ad hoc relocation. As we know, Italy and Malta have both said on various occasions that they're not okay with vessels coming into their ports anymore with people who were saved from the Mediterranean. And then the Commission has sort of called to European capitals and asked, are you guys willing to take these people? Are you guys willing to take these people? So we've had a group of countries, Finland included, who've said, okay, we can take 5 people from Malta or 8 people from Italy, or the other way around, I'm not sure. But anyway, like a handful of people. So we have these really ad hoc measures right now. And like I said before, discussions ongoing on how to solve this on a more permanent basis. And we have the new Commission, the von der Leyen Commission, who have said that they're going to somehow make a new beginning with these proposals on how to renew the Dublin especially. But we're yet to see how that's going to play out. So the old regulation is in place, but we're pondering on how to make it better, more functionable.
Sounds like quite a lot of uncertainty still, and it seems that the vessels trying to enter the harbors, they really wait for a long time, and there are human beings at the vessels.
Indeed, that's the case, and that's very unfortunate, and it has caused a lot of human suffering.
Matthias, you will share the insights of MEDAM analytical work on how migration policies in the EU can be made more effective and more human. How is the joint migration management done in the EU and countries of origin and transit?
Well, I think I can pick up on the few points that Anna-Kaisa has made. Maybe first the issue of how can we relocate people within the European Union and what exactly is the issue. We are right now looking at some of the numbers of people that have arrived, and it's very clear that there's only about 3 small EU member states that are seriously overburdened. And Italy is not one of them, because Italy is a fairly large country and Italy has not received that many asylum seekers. People have moved through Italy, but Italy didn't spend a lot of time and energy and money hosting them. So we really need solutions for Malta and Cyprus and Greece, actually, because in spite of the agreement with Turkey, a lot of people are still coming through Turkey to Greece, to the Greek islands, and the situation in the camps there, the hotspots on the Greek islands, is really very, very difficult. And so what we suggest for our conversations with stakeholders is that can we not have a voluntary relocation scheme for the relatively few people who are really at issue in Malta and Cyprus, and can we not work better with Turkey so that people who did actually have safety in Turkey can return to Turkey from the Greek islands. This is actually foreseen in the agreement with Turkey, but it's not working well, and there needs to be more in that. And the question, of course, is what do we have to do so that Turkey really can become a safer place for those refugees?
What are the main obstacles that it's not working well?
Well, the refugee status of Syrians in Turkey is still an issue. If you follow Turkish politics a little, you can see that even though the president especially has been very emphatic that refugees are guests and should be treated well, this is not the case for all politicians, one has to say. So there is an issue there. EU support for Turkey for refugees there has been forthcoming. So there's roughly 3 billion euros per year of support, very roughly speaking. But that is sort of uncertain. It's haggled over year after year, so that would have to become a lot more certain. And then one has to work from there, I think, but more continuous support for Turkey and stronger support, realizing how much Turkey is doing for 3 million refugees just from Syria would be a very good starting point. And I'll come back to other points later maybe, but this is...
Yeah.
And sort of relocation is the one thing, and when you look at how many people are arriving in the various EU countries, and you look at the population of the countries and the GDP, the economic ability to look after refugees, you find that apart from these 3 countries, no country is seriously overburdened. Italy certainly isn't, and the other countries aren't. As far as doing this on a mandatory basis is concerned, like we send these people everywhere, whether countries like it or not, this may not be a good idea. I wouldn't want to be the one symbolic refugee being sent to, say, Hungary. At the same time, we know that refugees that have gone to some of the poorer countries, including Portugal, which is doing a lot for its refugees, and Romania, they're simply not staying there because conditions elsewhere are better. So with the Schengen area being what it is, it has always been possible for people to move on, and sending people back under Dublin hasn't worked very well. So there's a lot of issues there that where procedures don't work well. And the solution that we can see in the short run is to have a voluntary relocation scheme on a somewhat larger scale than for the boats at present, and that would take care of the most urgent issues.
What about the political emphasis on sealing the external border?
I have to say that MEDAM researchers are discussing this amongst themselves. My personal take is that we have to do some of this. If we had completely open borders, life in Europe is still so relatively attractive that there would be far more people coming in than European countries would possibly be willing to host and to accommodate. So we need some sort of border management. We need a visa policy. If we want to have immigration for the labor market, we need to make sure that people first acquire some skills and languages and then move. So we do need to do migration management, and we need to do it together with the countries of origin and transit. So I think having a visa policy makes a lot of sense, and we cannot just open all the borders. And that means that we also have to tell people, no, you cannot come yet because you do not qualify yet. And at the same time, specifically in Libya, for example, there is UNHCR on the ground. They are running resettlement schemes for those who cannot return to their own countries. So there are ways we can help without necessarily inviting everybody to get on boats and somehow come to Europe.
It sounds extremely challenging to say that you can't come yet as you don't qualify yet. Where would that kind of wording happen?
Well, the basic institution is still that you need a visa to enter Europe from certain third countries, and you go and apply for that visa, and that's the basis of labor migration. Everybody has a right to emigrate from their own country, that's a human right, but you do not have the right to immigrate in a particular country of your choice. And it's actually not the EU, it's the member states that make immigration policy, and I don't see that changing. So, and then the question is, do we want to have a new Iron Curtain at the external borders, or can we actually work with the neighboring countries, like civilized states have always been working together to manage the borders and to ensure that people who cross the border are authorized to do so. And the big exception, of course, is asylum seekers. And the point is where can we help asylum seekers? Most of asylum seekers in the world do never manage to come to Europe because it takes a lot of money. You have to be physically robust to get on these boats. So quite arguably, the most vulnerable people will never make it. So what we have been arguing is that Europe should look much more seriously at our responsibility to protect refugees wherever they may be, which means a lot more support for countries like Turkey and Lebanon and Jordan that host a lot of refugees, and other countries like Uganda, where the refugees have no chance of ever getting to Europe. And that is possibly more important than focusing very much on the few who make it to Europe or ever have a chance to make it to Europe. Sort of make sure that refugees can be protected where they are, and there is a lot more that can be done there. And in the case of Libya, I think we don't want to go back to a situation like in 2016, when 4 times as many people were dying in the Mediterranean, but like 200,000 people were coming across on the boats. And there was a lot of search and rescue operations going on, but there was also a lot of dying going on in the Mediterranean. So if we want to do something about this, one way to do it is what's happening now actually for IOM, the International Organization for Migration, to help repatriate people to their own countries, because most people never get asylum. Most people who are in Syria now never get asylum in Europe. And then for those who cannot return for their own countries, to come under resettlement schemes under UNHCR, which is also going on in a small way and can be expanded. So there are ways of doing a lot for refugees immediately without opening all the borders in Europe and producing more exceptional situations.
Do the challenges with that, with the cooperation with the countries of origin, do they vary by country, from country to country, or are there similar things that connect the challenges?
Well, I think they do vary from country to country. Libya is basically a non-state, and some of the migrants there live under terrible conditions, and it's really important to help them to get out of the country. And there are international organizations that we can support better that are able to do it. And resettlement is one way of also taking some people into Europe without losing control over who is coming, because losing control has been a big issue. In Turkey, I think the conditions are much better, and with more support and also some resettlement, I can see there being a more constructive atmosphere. Other countries like Uganda have a much more positive attitude towards refugees, and there can be more support, and that would be helpful. But everything is not in a crisis mode, but happening in a much more constructive spirit.
Is there enough specific data about migration issues?
Well, when you ask the data specialists, of course, they will say no. When you ask people who sort of work on policies, like what exactly would you have to know in order to make better policies? I think we know enough about where the problems are, and we would know where to look for more data, and the data isn't the biggest issue. I think that there has to be more political will and quite a bit more money and a willingness to approach this constructively. Resettling a few tens of thousands of people is not such a big issue for rich European countries. Receiving a million refugees in a year like Germany did in 2015 is something that you can do once, but you couldn't do it year after year. That would seriously overstrain institutions, as we have seen in the case of Sweden, which probably received 2 or 3 times as many people as Germany over the years relative to their population. But now they have pretty much drawn up the drawbridge and said, no, we cannot go any further. We are not full, but our institutions are at capacity.
That sounds very clear. How have the stakeholders responded to your observations?
So far quite constructively, but we haven't gotten to the top level of government like, okay, why don't you give UNHCR 2 billion extra? That is still to happen, but there is certainly an understanding among many people that we need to listen seriously to the concerns of African countries, for example. I mean, taking back refugees sort of from Libya is politically easy for them. If it comes to having people first come to Europe and then sending them back to West Africa because they do not qualify for asylum, that is much more politically difficult for West African countries. And we have researchers now running around in West Africa and talking to stakeholders there, and it's clear that this is politically very difficult because migration in many poor countries is considered a lifeline for many families. They know that people are working, they're not drawing benefits in Europe, they are working. They may not be highly qualified staff that we are always looking for in Europe, but they are earning their living. So what's right about sending them back? So countries will not easily cooperate in that sort of migration management. And this is why we think we need to consider much more constructively legal migration opportunities for a lot of these countries that we are seeking to work with. Because a lot of the problems really arise because of the chaotic nature of some of this irregular migration. And it would be politically much easier for countries of origin in West Africa to cooperate with European countries if there were more legal opportunities and they could point to these legal opportunities. This would involve vocational training in the countries of origin, language training in the countries of origin. The people who are trained would have options either to stay in the countries of origin or come to Europe. This idea of skill partnerships has been around for a while. It's being tried out quite a bit in several European countries with several African countries. And I think we're getting to the point where this can be scaled up. So people have been quite receptive to that idea in Europe and certainly in Africa. But now is the point where we need to think about scaling it up, and we will need to see how that works. And it's slow process when you know about the issues with the recognition of vocational certifications from foreign countries. You can imagine that this becomes so much more difficult when you do it with workers from very different countries, like from West Africa. So this needs to be done on a case-by-case basis, working profession by profession, training scheme by training scheme, and doing a lot more. And we can see that there is a readiness to get this done. Now we will see how much of a push we will have, but there's certainly a willingness to listen there.
Anne-Marie, you will report on a special type of opinion survey that you have conducted in several European countries to find out what kind of asylum policy EU citizens will support. Please share us with your conclusions.
Sure. I'll start first by discussing very briefly the reason why we need an experiment. It's very hard to understand public opinion when it comes to asylum and refugee policy because there's strong humanitarian and moral norms associated with it, and often people are reluctant to share their true beliefs and views with an interviewer. So we use an experimental technique to extract people's true preferences. The work that I'll be sharing comes from a cross-national experiment that we conducted this spring in 8 European countries to understand what their views are for asylum and refugee policy. And the most important thing to think about when we think about asylum and refugee policy, that is, it's much more than simply the number of people who come and people's preferences for high or low numbers of asylum seekers and refugees. And that's because this policy area is about many things. It's about the way that people can access protection, the quality of protection that's provided, the way that national and European governments collaborate to manage it, and also the way, and we've talked about this already on the panel, the way in which external cooperation happens with third countries that are transit or origin. The aim of our study is to understand the public's preferences for all of these aspects, which we really don't know much about. So we want to know what are the specific aspects of asylum and refugee policy that increase or decrease public support for these types of policies. So what are the features that people support and what are the features that people oppose? What we've done, and I'll use some technical language and I hope to explain this as clearly as possible, but is we've conducted a fully randomized experiment that's known as a conjoint experiment in 8 countries using a nationally representative sample from each country. And what we do is we ask each of the respondents to rate and make policy choices. So they conduct 5 conjoint tasks. And what that means is that 5 times they're presented with 2 policies, policy A and policy B, and they just simply say which policy they prefer, A or B. And then they're again presented another time with a policy A and policy B. And by asking this many people to do this, we basically get 120,000 policies to be rated. And from these ratings, we are able to extract which types of policies encourage support and which types of policies encourage opposition. So I'll just start by showing you an example, and then I'll share our results. So in the survey, the respondents will be asked to rate 2 types of policies. Here we have policy A, and here we have policy B. The policies are described along 6 different dimensions, and I'll now go through each dimension. The first is resettlement of recognized refugees. And in this case, we are wondering how much does the person, how high or how low the level of recognized refugee resettlement is this person willing to accept? High, low, or none. And by this we refer to UN refugees that are actually resettled. So for instance, there is no resettlement, in this policy, there is no resettlement of United Nations recognized refugees directly from non-European countries, neighboring conflict regions to whatever your country. Okay? The second dimension is the return of asylum seekers whose applications have been unsuccessful. So what does the public think about people who are rejected? Where should they go? Should they be returned? And under what conditions should they be returned? In this case, this policy says refused asylum seekers are never sent back to countries where they could face harm. The third dimension is the decision on asylum applications. So who should decide who gets protection? In this case, policy A says a centralized European agency decides the applications for asylum. Finally, the next one is dimension is applications for asylum. So anyone can, in this case, it says anyone can apply for asylum in your country until there is an annual limit. This is, for instance, this annual limit currently does not exist, but in this policy it is proposed. The next dimension is financial assistance to non-European countries. So here it says, your country provides unconditional financial assistance to non-EU countries that host refugees. And the final dimension is family unification for refugees. So can recognized refugees then bring over their family members? And if so, under what conditions? And here it says a recognized refugee can always bring his or her spouse or children. So this is policy A, which has been randomly generated from all of the possible policy options. In the next slide, I'll share what those policy options are. And then they are presented with a randomly selected policy B, in which there is another configuration of options. In the case of this policy comparison between A and B, it differs in two ways. It differs in the final two ways. So in policy A, the country provides unconditional financial assistance to third countries. In policy B, it provides only conditional financial assistance if these countries agree to help and reduce asylum seekers to Europe. And in the final dimension, policy A provides the unconditional right of refugees to bring their children and family. And in policy B, it is a conditional right only if they can pay the cost of living. Now, in the experiment, these policies are randomly generated. So in some cases, like this one, policy A and policy B differ in two ways. In some cases, they might differ in 5 ways, or in all 6 ways. The person, we are unable to say, for instance, now we ask the person to choose between A and B. Suppose they choose B. For that exact person, we are unable to say whether they chose B because they were attracted to the conditionality associated with family reunification, or the conditionality associated with financial assistance. For that one individual, we are unable to say. But because we replicate this analysis over 16,000 people, we are able to say on aggregate what are the types of features of the policy which give support or opposition. So this is a bit of a technical feature. But through this process of randomization, we are able to actually extract what general public believes and prefers. I'll just briefly say something about the types of values and the types of policy features which we test. We test the idea for applications for asylum, whether the public does prefer limits to the current unlimited model of asylum seeking. We test then the levels of resettlement that people are willing to accept of recognized refugees, which is a different way for people to be admitted or to get protection. One way is asylum seeking, but the other way is recognized refugees. We test, of course, if some people are willing to accept returning people to dangerous situations, even if their asylum has been rejected. And family reunification, whether it's an unlimited right, conditional right, or should be absolutely rescinded or abolished altogether. And decisions on asylum applications, whether it should be European or it should be national. And finally, the types of financial assistance, unconditional, conditional, or absolutely no financial assistance to third countries. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip this graph and I'll just describe in words what we find. Okay? What we find is that the design of the policies matters to public preferences. And the types of policy features that increase public support for policy are numerical limits on asylum seeking, requirements, conditional requirements of having certain economic conditions in place to support family members that are reunified, conditional financial assistance of first countries of asylum. So that is to say, not necessarily unconditional money provided to third countries, but actually conditioning it on the agreement to limit asylum seekers coming to Europe. And then there are the features which actually reduce support. So there is reduced support for policies which centralize decision-making at the European Union. There's actually what reduces support also is completely removing protection and assistance altogether. So if there's no family reunification allowed, this actually reduces support, as it does unconditional financial assistance to first countries of asylum, and people are less likely to support policies which include returning refused asylum seekers if they might face harm. And people are opposed to policies which feature high levels of resettlement. There are some differences across countries, but and Finland isn't one of the countries that we've looked at. We've looked at Germany, Hungary, France, Spain, Italy, and Poland. Sweden, I suppose, is the closest, being a Nordic country, might be the closest to perhaps Finnish preferences, although there are surely some differences. And Sweden, it has very much these types of preferences that I've just described. So I'll just conclude and say that if we were to make a general statement about what we found is that Europeans are quite committed to providing protection and assistance. And in English we have this expression like, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. It's similar to the finding that we have, which is the sense that just because the system has struggled to cope in some way with the implementation, as we've talked about, of the refugees and asylum seekers, doesn't mean we should deny these rights and assistance altogether. However, there is a strong preference for policies that include limits and conditions on these rights to providing assistance and protection. And that is an important thing that comes out from our study. So I'll just leave it at that. And if you have any questions about the study, I'm very happy to answer.
Thank you very much, Anna-Mari. Was there something that took you by surprise with the results?
I have to say I was personally surprised that universally, maybe with one exception of Germany, most countries was preferred that asylum seeking be governed by their own national country, and there was quite, let's say, a large opposition to having a centralized European agency. This was quite surprising to me.
How do these results reflect to the electoral outcomes in the, for example, European Union elections?
I would say that they don't necessarily reflect the populist stance, which is, of course, people always wonder whether the public is also becoming extremely anti-immigration, anti-refugee, anti-asylum seeking, and it doesn't reflect, let's say, the public panic that you think what it would, and that has perhaps been played by political parties. And I would say, as a scholar of public opinion of immigration, it's often, I guess, a kind of non-finding, but it's a non-finding that goes against the narrative, is that most people feel quite neutrally about immigration in general. And here we find that actually there isn't necessarily this anti-immigration public panic that's talked about often in politics, but rather a sort of conservative approach to continuing to provide this human right. So, yeah, almost as if people want to protect the system.
Thank you. We switch the angle a little bit now, and Mauri, I'll ask you that the population is aging and the working force is declining in Finland and in other developed countries. And some people think, or some politicians suggest that we should raise the birth rate, which is kind of interesting with the climate change and overpopulation times. But anyways, what do you see as options to increase working age population?
Well, as we are here, I think immigration is the first thing that comes to mind. So that's the one thing. We talked about fertility before, and it's a variable that is really hard to make an impact on. Actually, you can tell a person that now make more babies. It doesn't work that way. It's about the environment and the society and all those things, and it's I see it as not being such a policy choice.
And very slow to
And very
affect
slow
that,
too, although important in the long run, but slow. But on the contrary, immigration is clearly more of a policy choice, and that's why that's one option. Of course, like the number of working age population is not the only important factor. Actually, what we are interested in is the employment rate, or the unemployment rate, or the activity rate, or the amount of people studying, and so on. So actually, by increasing these rates, we can make the kind of impacts that we actually want to make in a society. So we have talked a lot about increasing employment rate. That is the government's goal actually at the moment, and it's a good goal, and that's one thing I would really focus on.
Do you see a desire to solve this through immigration?
Yeah, I do. In the political scene, I think there is a desire to increase immigration, but it's somewhat hard because first of all, there's the populist movement, which is actually it's quite clever in using statements of like politicians for its own good, and that's why some politicians are maybe a little bit too careful about saying things about immigration that should be said, I think, a bit more openly. So that's one thing. Another thing to keep in mind, I think, is that, to be honest, in Finland, migration or work-related migration, it's probably not the thing that will solve the problems of our public economy. So, because let's be honest, it's a small thing still in here, and it's also actually a long-run thing. But it's one factor that certainly will help. And there's well, talking about immigration or work-based immigration, but let's talk about immigration in general. About the economic effect is mainly determined by the employment rate. So if a person X comes from the outside of EU, say, if he or she is likely to become employed, that's going to be a good thing. That's actually going to be a very good thing for the public economy. But on the other hand, if he is not going to be active or do something that will actually be more kind of increases expenses of the public sector, that's a bad thing. So that's kind of a clear thing, but it should be kept in mind at all times, I think.
What do you say that what kind of policy measures should or could be used for that purpose, that there would be more migrants in the labor market in Finland in particular?
Yeah, I think the first thing is to just kind of tear down the unnecessary barriers that there are at the moment. So in practice, what it means is that the process of firms recruiting from abroad, from outside of EU, I'm mainly talking about outside of EU in this context, because within the EU, the Schengen zone, it's not such a big problem, but from outside of the EU, at the moment, it's somewhat hard, or at least difficult for companies to recruit people. And it's actually it's pretty, it can take up to, while ago it could have taken up to like 12 months for the process to come through. And that's a crazy time from the individual perspective that is coming to Finland to work, or from the firm's perspective. That's totally too difficult thing. At the moment, I checked the last numbers. At the moment, the time that when the recruitment process starts from the time that it finalizes, it's about 4 months at the moment. So that's better than a while ago. I would say a lot better, but still it's too slow, I think. So most of the time, or at least many times, when a firm wants to recruit from the outside of the EU, and actually I'm not talking about like very high wage professionals, but I'm talking about more like say normal labor force. It's yeah, the government now in their program, they actually said that they state that 1 month on average should be the time that the recruitment process should take. And I think that's a great goal, and that's what we should strive forward to. And in practice, you asked what should we do about it. To make the process easier, to make the kind of you cannot monitor the kind of the process to like in detail. You have to give some that up and trust the companies to follow the Finnish law, which should be, I think, the basic point here. So we all follow the law, and if something happens, then there should be a way or process for the government or the state to intervene.
Matthias, how do these sound from Germany perspective?
Well, basically right, of course. But there is a sort of a challenge that we have learned a bit the hard way following 2015 and looking at the challenge of integrating roughly 1 million recognized refugees as they are now becoming in Germany. Mauri just said the big thing is the employment rate, and of course that is right, that is the first big thing. The second big thing is the wage level that people can earn and the kind of jobs they can actually get if and when they are employed. The big challenge is to convince people, and of course in Germany in 2015, and this would have been similar here, we had a lot of young men coming in their 20s who were really keen to earn some money quickly and send it back to their families, wherever their families might be, which is natural and good, and we should encourage that. But at the same time, it's not only, I think, that the German labor market is very bureaucratic, which it also is, but you also, compared to Syria or Afghanistan, you sort of need formal qualifications and formal training in order to succeed in the labor market and not stick with very unskilled and low-paid jobs. And convincing people to learn the language and go through 3 years of vocational training plus 2 years of language learning and only then earn serious money has been very, very difficult for many people in the employment agencies that are dealing with this. And this is the big challenge, I think, getting people into jobs where they can permanently support themselves, will be able to have families, and ultimately maybe even contribute to the welfare state. If they all sort of just get jobs at the very low-skilled level, they will remain net beneficiaries of the welfare state, which is okay when you're thinking of refugees, and then this is a humanitarian obligation that a country is taking on, and that's fine. I think this may well cost us some money, and Germany, like Finland, is a rich country, so we can afford that. But it also says, well, if we are looking for immigration to support the welfare system at a time of declining fertility and aging populations, then this is not the kind of vocational integration that you may be looking for. So the big challenge really is vocational qualification to a serious level, meaning the sort of full vocational training certificate that you typically get after 3 years training in Germany, or at least the sort of semi-skilled certificate that you get after 2 years. And that is the big challenge.
Mari, how do you comment on that some people worry that migration will lead that the wages will decline and it will eventually lead to that it will increase inequality in the country?
Yeah, very good question. Before I answer that, I'd like to comment on Matthias. I think that's a great point, and actually it's, I think, very important at least in terms of policies, to separate the kind of the humanitarian immigration from that of the mostly work-based immigration, because actually the tools used for these two groups are pretty different, and actually the qualifications or the features of these two groups are quite different, and that's why we have to use way different policies to integrate these two groups, and they also have way different motivations. I think the first group, say the work-related, coming from work-related reasons, that can be based on economical reasons. But on the other hand, the humanitarian group is, I think, is more of a value choice, because it probably will cost the society a bit more than it will, at least in the short run, will give. And that also, for that reason, these two kind of groups are very, very different and should be kind of talked a bit differently, at least in the policy sense. About the wage level about the immigration effect on wage level or employment, there's actually kind of I won't say a lot of research, but there is like sufficient amount of research on that matter, and the international research mainly says that it doesn't on average have a big effect on the wage rates in a particular country. So say there was this one, as we call natural experiment in Cuba, for instance, which is quite a famous one. So from Cuba, they immigrated in a very short time a lot of people to America, to Florida. We're talking about over 100,000 immigrants in a very short period of time, and actually, what we see that the effects in the Miami or in the Floridan labor market is basically non-existent. So we don't really see a lot of effect, and actually that observation repeats itself in many situations. So the effect is actually quite small. Okay, there are a few caveats in that though. So it also matters what kind of education or a skill level the immigrant has. So typically the immigrants that come to a country to work, they have a lower skill level than the say natives. So what they do is actually they compete for the same jobs with the low skill set possessing natives or other immigrants. And actually, they might have a bit of a negative impact on those groups. But on the other hand, at the same time, they can actually, in many cases, they can have positive impact on the wage level of the highly skilled native ones or the immigrants. And on average, the effect is pretty much zero. But taking this into account, and when you think about the political process, actually, it can be a bit of a pickle, I think, for a politician, because if there's a small group that really is making a loud noise that they are facing this competition from abroad, and they are having hard time in the labor market, although it's not generalizable at all, but still it can have a big impact on the policies that the country makes. So that's why it's I think it's a harder question than the research actually suggests.
Interesting. We have a contributor at the audience. Maria Hegman is the head of international affairs at STTK, and you will share some views about the immigrations in the working place.
Yes, thank you. Oh, okay. Thank you. I'm going to see how I can work this out with having my notes on the phone as well. Thank you very much for the possibility to comment, and I'm going to start off by thanking Mauri for very good points. We agree with many of them from a labor market side. I should say that STTK is a labor market organization, and we represent about 500,000 Finnish workers. And I will also comment from the labor-based immigration perspective and not the humanitarian. So as Mauri already told us, and as we've been discussing, there is going to be a considerable gap in the labor market. By 2030, we're going to have 75,000 people less in the Finnish labor market. And this is because of this decreasing birth rate that has been mentioned, but also other demographics. Our view is that Finland needs a very holistic and broad immigration program to fill this gap, that this will be one of the ways that we can solve that we can upkeep our welfare services and also the dependency ratio and have a sustainable society also in the future. We also believe that a holistic program would be needed on EU level as well, and that these programs should prevent grey economy from forming, keep up sustainable working conditions and jobs. I'm very glad that you took up very many of the things that we have also pointed out, that skills is actually a key point, language is a key point when integrating people in the labor market, and that getting a job is actually what is crucial for integration, and we need more structured programs for this as well. We have quite a big gap, Europeanly speaking and comparatively, between people accessing the labor market that are residents in Finland or of the established population and of people coming here. So it takes about 10 years for an immigrant of being in Finland to actually get to the point where the male population has an employment rate of 71%, and for women it's 56%. So we have a lot of untapped potential here as well for employing people and bringing people into society. Also, from an economic point of view, investing in integration pays itself back because of employment, because we then avoid marginalization and other negative effects of unemployment on the economy, and as well as tax revenues and lost tax revenues and income transfers. So yes, our recipe would also include a lot of language training, giving language training to give direct access to jobs, also looking at the skill sets to have different models for developing skills, both when it comes to language skills, vocational education, higher level education. So finding these sort of tailored ways to bring the people that are already in Finland into the labor market, also looking at other groups, foreign exchange students and so forth. We need more skilled workforce in Finland, but we can't only compete for this skilled workforce with other very potentially attractive countries for them. So these would be some of the things. And my last point, I think, for not taking too much out of the time, is to also look at the language in which we introduce people into the labor market. We tend to do this in Finland in Finnish or Swedish, which is not necessarily the language that most immigrants are familiar with, but we should look at also being able to do this in other languages and the mother tongues of the people that come here. So I'm going to stop there and thank you very much to both Väestöliitto and the panel for a good discussion.
Thank you. Now combined all this what we have heard here today and Maria asking for a holistic approach, what do you think that are all these combined enough in the area, the earlier subjects? Or is this, do the governments or the European Union try to solve this sector by sector? Who wants to start? We're going to keep this now more discussional, so I don't have to ask, you can comment on. Would you give the microphone for Mauri?
Yeah, first of all, thank you for the comment. I have to say I don't really disagree much of that, so that was a very I think, a very good comment. So yeah, skills, language, EU level cooperation. Yes, very, very good. And I would like to add a few things concerning the labor markets and immigration, and especially the labor-based immigration. And first thing I think is a research question, or that kind of. So the thing is, I think we don't have a lot of evidence-based facts about how the actual integration policies in Finland work. I mean, we have a lot of like reports, and we have, of course, a lot of opinions, and we have this like silent knowledge from those people that work with the integration process. But actually, we don't have a lot of, I would say, almost non-existent amount of academic research that would actually make some sort of experiments that we would be able to make causal interpretations. And it would be possible, I think, in terms of law, to do that kind of experiments, but it's been too, it hasn't been utilized enough. I think that would be the first step to learn and know what actually works within the Finnish institutions, and then we can actually make better judgment and policy choices in the future. But that takes time, and it actually costs some money. So there are these constraints, obviously. Another point about the labor market is that the literature actually underlines the kind of the flexibility of the labor market to be a key point in the employment success of an immigrant. So if an immigrant goes to a place wherein the labor market is somewhat flexible, such as, say, US is an example, actually the integration is pretty decent, and there are like less barriers. But on the other hand, if there are high barriers for employment or say language barriers, such as in Finland, or other kind of barriers, actually the integration is not that efficient. And so kind of the policy response that I take is to make the labor market such that it would actually take care of the most vulnerable groups, to make them work kind of easier or with higher probability, and typically immigration, and especially immigration that is, say, asylum seekers or such, they are in a not so good position in the labor market. So that is one reason that actually we like to underline the flexibility of the labor market also in this context.
Do you, Anna-Kaisa, agree that there should be more research to have a specific Finnish approach?
Labor migration.
And also included the other sectors to this?
I'm sure that we definitely do need more research and sort of data to base our decisions on. And I think, Mauri, you said that there should be also an EU-wide sort of look at things. As far as I understand, the labor migration is not in the EU competences yet, so we should then think of on a sort of higher level on if we want to change that or not. And then in the last couple of weeks, there's been some talk in the media. I believe it was the Minister for Interior that in some interview suggested slightly that the asylum seekers who've found jobs here in Finland and sort of they've taken the first steps of integrating and being in the labor market, even if their requests for asylum are rejected, maybe we should consider trying to keep them in the labor market. And this might be something to consider, obviously, even though it might also have, there might be problems that we should also consider. And if you allow, I would like to maybe throw the ball to our German guest or guests. I understand that in Germany there's also been some talk about this Spurwechsel of kind of similar concept of trying to keep asylum seekers with jobs in the labor market. So maybe, if you wish, you could maybe elaborate on that, if it works, if it's been pushed through, and how it's been perceived.
Yes, thank you. I can try to do that, but as you hinted, it's a very involved discussion. The point is, of course, if you tell people, well, you can come to Germany and maybe you don't get asylum, but if you are here anyway and you're working, then you may stay. It may create an incentive for people not to go through the legal channels, which we don't have right now anyway, the way we should. But there is an issue. People don't go through the legal channels, but simply apply for asylum, even though they know they don't really have a chance, and asylum wouldn't be for them. So you would tend to undermine the asylum system if that happens too much. On the other hand, the asylum system in Germany has been very, very inefficient, in the sense that people have been in the court system for years going through appeals over asylum decisions, and therefore the question is, couldn't we make this, even then after there is a final sort of a rejection, very often people are never effectively sent back. It just doesn't happen for a lot of reasons, because deportations are ugly and they're expensive, and it just doesn't happen. So couldn't we make life much easier for everybody by just saying, well, if they are well integrated, let's just allow them to stay. And this is in the books, in the law in Germany. The barriers are quite high. But if you think this is great humanitarian news, I would just ask you to think of those people who really haven't been able to integrate well for all sorts of difficult reasons. It may be circumstances, it may be themselves, and then they may be particularly vulnerable, and then they get sent back. Well, they don't get sent back anyway. So putting this condition there is sort of sounds like solving a problem, but it may be creating more problems. So our take has been that why can we think about maybe first of all dealing with all the old cases. If people have been there for a long time, it's just not fair to send them back to some place where they have lost all contact. So let's do that, but then also have a clean break in the asylum system, have much faster decisions, and then work with countries of origin so that we can actually return people who will then be readmitted with some support. And so in that sense, the Spurwechsel, this track change, going from the track of asylum to the asylum application to the track of labor migration, would be mostly for old cases, if you like, or exceptional cases that have dragged on for a very long time. But otherwise, the way the discussion is going, and I would personally tend to agree with that, it's sort of difficult to justify. There's a lot of justification, I think, being more liberal about labor migration and giving out more work visa. But that should be to everybody, and you shouldn't have to make an unjustified asylum application in order to get there. You should be able to say clearly who you are and why you want to do this and what your qualifications are. So yes, I think it may be helpful as an exceptional measure, but not as a forward-looking policy.
We haven't talked about deportations much, but is my understanding correct that it varies from country to country, that which countries are considered safe to return, that the practices are different?
Yes, I think it does vary very widely. For example, Germany usually does not send people back to Afghanistan unless they basically have become, have been involved in seriously criminal behavior. That's the only reason why men are sent back and nobody else is, basically. Whereas countries, I think, including Norway and Switzerland, are quite frequently sending back anybody to Afghanistan, even gay people for that matter, who may seriously be at risk if they are sent back. So the standards are very different, and this is one of the things that the reforms of the Dublin system, and it's actually not the Dublin system, but the reforms of the European asylum system that the Commission is working on could be helpful at establishing clearer standards and more communication among the asylum offices of the various EU countries to arrive at a better harmonized practice there.
That has been an important issue in Finland as well, that some people have been very active about that, the deportations. Now I will turn to the audience. Do you have any questions or comments to the panel?
Hello, I'm Kristina Linna. I work at SAEK, the Central Organization for Finnish Trade Unions, and we represent about 900,000 workers, not white collars like Maria, but normal workers. And nobody has mentioned here today the word exploitation. And I'd like to tell you that, for example, Europol and the labor inspectors from all countries have been working against exploitation of migrant workers for about 10 years already. And there is exploitation of migrant workers in every European country. And like you said, I don't remember, Mauri, yeah, that we have to trust the employers. But I'm sorry to say that we can't. So there needs to be control, like from the law enforcement and labor inspection, and we all have to work together to prevent exploitation. That's all I wanted to say.
Mauri, do you want to comment? And maybe Matthias, do you have from the other countries' perspective a comment for that?
Yeah, I'll comment it like that. Yeah, I do take exploitation seriously in every country and also in Finland, and it is probably true that the kind of the share of exploitation is higher in the in the businesses that the immigrants go to than in like other businesses or companies, and that's a fact and it should be like really delved into and taken seriously. But at the same time, I'm kind of I kind of don't like that it is used against immigration in general. I mean, I think it's no excuse, or it's not like a reason to be against immigration just because there are exploitation. I think exploitation is like it's not the core reason, but it's something that follows from, and we should kind of try to solve the problem as efficiently as possible, but still kind of being positive on the immigration in general.
Other questions or comments from the audience? Yes, and please tell your name.
Thanks. Good day, I'm Olli Savolainen from Viitasaari, and I have some remarks on, I don't have any questions, sorry. I have comments on the study that Mauri mentioned. I don't remember if it was by David Card or Giovanni Peri, but on the so-called boat-lift Marielito study, where about the Cubans, that natural experiment. And if I remember right, George Borjas has tortured the data on the same study and from his own angle and arrived at the opposite conclusions. And as it is a natural experiment, you can't really with certainty attribute the wage effects to the migration per se. And there have been some other hypotheses like the cocaine boom in Miami at the same time. which is not perhaps completely independent of the Cubans, but anyway, it's not a good example in my opinion. And you guys from the Chamber of Commerce and pension funds and even some labor organizations have called for the abolishment of the so-called assessment of native labor availability, saatavuusharkinta. And I don't know why it is in place, perhaps because of protection for Finnish laborers, but it also has the good side effect that it protects Finnish public finances from the negative impacts of uncontrolled labor migration, as in a welfare state like Finland, it takes a very high wage, well above the median, to positively contribute to the public finances. When you account for children and all the things contingent on the laborer himself.
Thank you for your comments. I have to stop you there that they have enough time to answer you. Sorry about
okay,
that.
Okay.
Yeah, I understood that Anne-Marie, you wanted to say something, and I understand Mauri and maybe Matthias also.
I'll start by thanking you for your healthy dose of skepticism regarding the study in Miami. You're right to say that there's been a considerable amount of debate regarding the actual results of that natural experiment. And I think we can generally agree that while the effects, as Mauri said, that have been null or no effect for general populations, there are perhaps some serious effects on the wages of certain subgroups, and these are not necessarily to be ignored just because the general average effect is not is null. Having said that, I'm also skeptical of this study for other reasons, which is mainly as an American. I can tell you that the American exceptionalism in regarding the nature of immigration and the nature of our labor market, and the fact that academics tend to study American cases, doesn't necessarily mean that we can learn so much from the European context. So really advocating for European-based studies to further understand, because what we can extrapolate from a small case in Miami does not necessarily hold for us in Europe today. So I'll just leave that, I think, on the Borjas study. That's my general take.
Yeah, good point, and I also I support the skepticism in this case as well. But although it's the most, perhaps the most famous case, it's truly not the only case that has been studied in various cases, and there are, well, most of the research is from the States, but there are a lot of research, I think, from Europe as well. And you mentioned Giovanni Peri, I think, and he just a while ago published like a good study that actually draws lots of conclusions about the labor market effects of immigration together, and I recommend that to be checked out. It's a good study. About you mentioned the saatavuusharkinta, that is the assessment of native availability. I guess that's a good translation. And what it means is basically that there is an assessment to be made around the country whether some professionals are allowed to come and work in Finland or not. And if the assessment that is made by the state basically, or the local local body of the state, if the assessment is negative, then your migration permit will be denied, and that's that basically. It's not a big thing anymore in Finland. Actually, we're talking about, I think, few thousand people on a yearly basis, so it's not a very big thing. But in principle, I think it's still a very bad thing, because what it does, it actually monopolizes and creates barriers to the labor market that allows certain professions to kind of shield their work from competition. And that's not good. And I think the argument that it prevents immigration that is not in control is not a very good one, because that's not actually a factor that would actually have a big impact on the flows anyways. The control thing is, I think, in other places and maybe within the EU level, that we are, as mentioned before, how we feel about the migration policy being in control. So yeah, good point, and I think you said it, that it shields some professions and some from competition, and I agree, but my take is that it should be abolished as soon as possible, I think, but we can agree to disagree on this point.
I think we are 10 seconds over time, so my last question, you only get to answer yes or no. In general, would you say that the issues we discussed today, that is it clear how EU will proceed to the 2020s?
Is
with
it clear?
With the
no.
No, it's not clear.
Well, I would say luckily not, because our research project has just been extended by 3 years and we would have nothing to do. so no, there is a lot of conversations to be had and things to be developed further.
No, it's certainly very uncertain and very unclear.
Thank you very, very much. It was super interesting to hear your insights, and thank you for the dedicated audience also. You were very well present here and stayed through this interesting panel. So thank you and have a great day and a weekend.